The date is January 11th, 1923. At dawn, on a grey winter morning, the silence of the Ruhr Valley is broken by the clatter of foreign boots. French and Belgian troops move past coal pits and factory chimneys, rifles slung over greatcoats as they occupy the industrial heart of Germany. On the platforms, German railwaymen stand motionless, watching their own economy being led away like rolling stock. They have not come for conquest. They have come for payment. Germany has fallen behind on the reparations imposed after the Great War. If Berlin will not send coal and steel voluntarily, Paris will take them. But there is one fact no army column can change. Germany has no means left to fight. The Versailles Treaty has dismantled its armed forces. Faced with an invasion it cannot resist, with weapons, the German state reaches for the only remaining weapon it believes it has: refusal. From Berlin, the call goes out for passive resistance. Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno's government urges every worker in the Ruhr to lay down tools. Miners are told not to mine, railwaymen not to drive trains, clerks not to cooperate with the occupying authorities in any way. The engine room of the German economy is ordered to go dark. It feels like a moral victory. It is, in fact, the opening move in a financial catastrophe, because the government adds a second promise. Every striking worker who now produces nothing will continue to be paid in full. A nation that has just ordered its main industrial region to stop generating wealth has committed itself to paying millions of wages out of thin air. That decision will soon reach every kitchen table in Germany. A few months later, in the spring of 1923, you walk into a bakery in Berlin. Not long ago, a loaf of bread cost 250 marks. Later that day, you sit down at a cafe. The menu lists a cup of coffee at 5,000 marks. You order one and try not to think about what that number would have meant a year earlier. When you finish and ask for the bill, the waiter takes the menu from your table. Someone has crossed out the price with a thick pencil. Next to it is the new figure, 8,000 marks. The coffee is the same. The table is the same. Only the money has changed while you were drinking it. This is not yet the grotesque image that will define the era in popular memory, not the wheelbarrows piled high with notes worth less than their own metal fittings. This is the beginning, when ordinary people still believe they live in a world governed by rules. They still keep household ledgers. They still believe that somewhere above them there are institutions whose purpose is to protect the value of the money in their pockets. They are wrong. Behind the shop fronts and cafes, inside offices lined with dark wood and brass lamps, a different story is unfolding. At its center sits the president of the Reichsbank, Rudolf Havenstein. He is not a demagogue or a speculator. He is a meticulous imperial-era bureaucrat who believes that his task is to serve the German state, whatever shape that state now takes. The war taught him one lesson. When the government needs money, the central bank supplies it. The mechanism is brutally simple. The Reichsbank is not independent. By law, it must accept any treasury bill the government presents. Each time the state needs cash, it sends the bank an IOU. In return, the bank prints fresh paper marks and hands them over. The government uses those marks to pay its bills, first for shells and rifles, later for pensions and salaries, now for the wages of millions of workers ordered not to work at all. It is a conveyor belt made of ink and obligation, and Havenstein stands at the controls, convinced that switching it off would be a betrayal. By 1923, the fire is already smoldering. The war was financed not by taxing the population, but by borrowing from it. Citizens bought war bonds, believing they were lending to victory. When defeat came, those bonds became scraps of paper. The money created against them remained in circulation, pushing prices up and eroding savings. The occupation of the Ruhr does not create this process. It accelerates it beyond imagination. Passive resistance means the Ruhr now produces almost nothing, yet wages continue to flow. The tax system, based on profits and incomes calculated in a currency that shrinks by the week and then by the day, begins to disintegrate. By the time tax bills are assessed and sent, the sums written on them barely matter. There is only one source of money left for the German state, the presses of the Reichsbank. At first, it is still possible to pretend. Banknotes arrive in thicker stacks. It is easy to blame the French, the treaty, speculators somewhere abroad. But in bakeries, at cafe tables, across the counters of small shops, unease hardens into fear. Men and women who once trusted that a mark was a mark now scan the newspaper each morning for a different figure, the exchange rate against the dollar. Quietly, the real unit of value is shifting away from their own currency. They do not know it yet, but their money is already dying, and it is not being murdered in secret by distant markets. It is being sacrificed openly and patriotically by their own leaders and their own central bank, offered up as fuel for a political strategy that mistakes self-destruction for courage. In the spring of 1923, as the queues lengthen and the chalkboards fill with ever larger numbers, the institution they trust most, the Reichsbank itself, has become the engine of their ruin. The catastrophe visible in 1923 had not begun in the bakeries or the cafes. It began 5 years earlier, in the ruins of an empire that no longer existed. In November 1918, the guns fell silent, the Kaiser fled, and a fragile new republic was proclaimed in Berlin. It was called Weimar, and from the moment of its birth, it carried a burden it could not lift. That burden was written into the Treaty of Versailles. In 1919, Germany was presented not with a peace, but with a bill, 132 billion gold marks in reparations, payable not in paper promises, but in real value. It was a figure beyond ordinary comprehension, large enough that many understood it for what it was, an attempt not just to compensate, but to break. The Allies, and especially a wounded, vengeful France, wanted guarantees that German power would never again threaten Europe. The reparations schedule was the guarantee. To pay in gold, a nation needs gold. Germany's reserves were depleted. Its merchant fleet, colonies, and foreign assets were gone. The only route left to earn what Versailles demanded was through exports: coal, steel, chemicals, machinery, the output of an industrial system that had once been the envy and fear of Europe. But large parts of that system had been carved away. Alsace-Lorraine was lost. Pieces of Silesia were lost. Factories, mines, and rail lines had new flags above them. Germany was being asked to pay a bill with tools that had been deliberately removed from its hands. The new republic's official strategy was called the fulfillment policy. Berlin would attempt to meet the terms exactly, shipping goods westward, in the hope that visible effort and visible strain would prove the bill impossible and force a revision. The policy's architects believed that compliance would expose the treaty's absurdity. In practice, each trainload of coal that went to France as reparations warmed French homes instead of German ones. Wealth flowed out, resentment stayed behind. There was another decision, older and more corrosive, that shaped what came next. During the war, rather than impose heavy taxes on a population already strained by rationing and casualties, Berlin chose to borrow. Posters urged citizens to buy war bonds. Families subscribed out of patriotism and fear. Behind the rhetoric, the Reichsbank quietly created new marks to purchase those bonds. Money was conjured into existence. The cost of war was pushed into the future. When defeat came, the bonds could not realistically be honored. Default, formal or informal, was inevitable, but the money created against them remained in circulation, chasing a limited supply of goods. Prices crept upward. Savings bought less each year. The mark was already sick when Versailles arrived. The treaty simply added a crushing external weight to an internally weakened body. Rudolf Havenstein assumed the presidency of the Reichsbank in this landscape. He was an imperial-era banker, precise, dutiful, and convinced that the central bank's primary role was to serve the state. He had been formed in a world where the authority of the government and the stability of the currency were assumed to rise and fall together. In his mind, supporting the former guaranteed the latter. The idea that the two could be in opposition, that the state itself might demand actions that would destroy the currency, never fully entered his thinking. The value of the mark was not sacred. It was a tool, and tools could be sacrificed if the survival of the nation demanded it. The law formalized that subservience. The Reichsbank was obliged to discount any treasury bill the government presented. In plain terms, whenever the state ran short of money, it handed an IOU to Havenstein's institution. The bank printed fresh paper marks and credited the government's account. There was no independent board empowered to refuse, no metallic anchor to impose discipline. There were only ink, paper, and signatures. As long as there were blank sheets to feed into the presses, the mechanism could run. For a while, habit and hope covered the damage. At home, savers still trusted the numbers in their bank books, comforted by the familiarity of official stamps and ornate banknote designs. Abroad, trading partners continued to accept marks as payment, at least at first, because they had always done so, but every month prices crept higher. Housewives noticed that the same basket of goods cost slightly more. Pensioners watched their fixed incomes stretch a little less far. The internal debts of the war and the external burden of reparations combined like overlapping pressures on a cracked wall. The structure still stood, but it was no longer sound. When French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr in January 1923, they did not create that crack. They simply kicked out one of the last supports. The Ruhr was not a distant province to be written off on a map. It was the industrial heart of Germany. Coal pits and blast furnaces, coking plants and rail yards, a landscape of chimneys and cranes. By occupying it, France aimed to take reparations directly in coal and steel, filling its own trains with the output of German mines and mills. For Germany's leaders, allowing the region to function smoothly under foreign officers and foreign flags felt like accepting permanent humiliation. Their response was to weaponize stoppage. The call for passive resistance turned economic paralysis into a political statement. Miners were ordered to leave the pits. Railwaymen refused to drive trains. Office clerks shut their ledgers and walked away. In the occupied zone, machinery went silent. Locomotives cooled. Conveyor belts gathered dust. Across the rest of Germany, newspapers printed photographs of idle workers and hailed their defiance. For a short, heady moment, it felt as if the nation had discovered a way to fight without guns. The gesture might have been brief if it had not been paired with a promise. The government vowed that every worker who joined the resistance would receive full wages. Firms would be compensated for losses. Pensions and salaries would continue. A state that had just told its main industrial region to stop producing guaranteed that no one who obeyed would bear the economic cost. Passive resistance would be costless for the resistors. The bill would be paid by someone else, somewhere else, sometime later. There was almost no revenue with which to keep that promise. The tax system was collapsing under inflation. Assessments were calculated in marks that lost value between the day they were computed and the day payment was due. By the time a company handed over its taxes, a 1,000,000-mark bill might be worth a handful of tram tickets. The faster prices rose, the more meaningless the numbers became. Audit reports and budget tables turned into fiction between 1 month and the next. The state's income evaporated faster than it arrived. What remained was the same instrument that had financed the war, the printing press at the Reichsbank. Ministries lined up with demands. State railways needed money for wages and coal. Postal services needed money for salaries, fuel, and repairs. Local governments needed money to keep schools and hospitals open. Above them all loomed the payrolls of millions of striking workers in the Ruhr, a river of payments flowing into an industrial basin that now produced almost nothing in return. Every week that the strike continued widened the gap between the real output of the economy and the nominal promises written on paper. Havenstein did not see an option to refuse. To him, starving the resistance of money would mean sabotaging the last non-military weapon Germany possessed. He saw himself as the logistical commander of a national struggle and concluded that his duty was to supply funds without limit. Where an independent central banker might have spoken of price stability and credibility, Havenstein spoke of loyalty and obligation. And obligation, in his mind, meant printing. The Reichsbank's own facilities could not keep up. New presses were ordered. When even that proved insufficient, the bank enlisted private firms. By the spring of 1923, more than 100 commercial printers and dozens of state offices were churning out banknotes. Machines that had once printed catalogs and railway timetables now hammered day and night, spitting sheets of marks. Workers who had once set type for novels now aligned plates for 10,000 mark notes. Blank paper itself became a strategic resource, bought up in bulk and paid for with the very currency soon to be printed on it. At the start of the year, the money supply was already swollen. Within a few months, it had more than quadrupled. Shortly after, it was 8 times higher. By midsummer, it was nearly 20 times. Each additional note diluted the value of all the others. Yet inside the Reichsbank, officials spoke earnestly of a shortage of currency because queues were forming at bank counters and businesses pleaded for more cash to meet rising nominal prices. They mistook a collapse in trust for a lack of physical notes. On the streets, in shops, at kitchen tables, people did not need statistics to see what was happening. The problem was not that marks were scarce. The problem was that marks were turning into ice in a furnace. Holding them, even for a day, meant watching them vanish. So Germans began to change their behavior in a way that would push the crisis into a different, more violent phase. The moment wages were paid, they had to be spent. Not next month, not next week, today, preferably within the hour. Waiting meant loss. Spending meant at least a chance to turn paper into something that would still exist tomorrow. This reflex acquired a name, the flight into real assets. Once, prudence had meant saving, leaving a portion of one's wages in a bank book, accumulating claims on the future. Now, prudence meant exactly the opposite. The cautious saver, the person who still treated a mark as something to be stored, was punished with mathematical cruelty. Their balance remained the same on paper, while prices in shops and markets arced upward like artillery shells. Saving had become a slow form of self-destruction. So people bought. They bought things they did not strictly need because need itself was being rewritten. A piano, a carpet, a case of wine, a stock of coal, a spare pair of boots. These were no longer indulgences, but lifeboats. Anything tangible was better than holding a currency that evaporated between sunrise and dusk. The moment wages were paid, crowds surged into shops. In some districts, wives waited outside factory gates at noon. When sirens signaled the lunch break, workers hurried to the pay window, collected bundles of notes, and thrust them into their spouses' hands. Then the race began. They were not racing one another. They were racing the exchange rate. Somewhere in the city, a telegraph click would bring the latest figure. How many paper marks $1 could buy that hour? Shopkeepers pinned the updated number behind their counters or scribbled adjustments onto chalkboards. They no longer thought in marks. They thought in dollars or in gold, converting only at the last moment into the national currency that had ceased to be a measure of value and become merely the vehicle of payment. The shoes, the coat, the sack of flour, they had a price in something real. The mark was just the mask that price wore for a few minutes. If a wife reached the bakery 5 minutes before the new exchange rate arrived, she might leave with 2 loaves. If she arrived 5 minutes after, her money might buy half of one. Wages lost meaning as a measure of reward for effort. A day's labor could vanish in the time it took a clerk to update a blackboard. In this environment, money changed hands with unnatural speed. Economists call this the velocity of circulation, but the phrase is too bloodless for what was happening. Cash burned through pockets. It slid across counters, into tills, and out again almost instantly as shopkeepers tried to rid themselves of it by restocking. The faster people fled from paper into real goods, the faster prices rose. Inflation was no longer driven only by the printing presses. It was driven by fear. The middle class, the backbone of any modern society, found itself in a uniquely cruel position. Small shop owners, teachers, civil servants, clerks, retired officers, widows living on pensions. These were the people whose status and dignity rested on savings, on fixed incomes, on predictability. They had done what they were supposed to do. They had bought war bonds. They had trusted government insurance schemes. They had accumulated nest eggs in respectable banks. Now they watched as those reserves shrank into nothing. Landlords, bound by rent contracts denominated in marks, collected monthly payments that could no longer cover basic repairs, let alone their own living expenses. A tenant's rent for an entire flat might be worth less than a loaf of bread by the time it was paid. Properties that had once represented generational wealth became burdens or were sold for foreign currency at fractions of their former value. Respectable families pawned heirlooms and wedding rings for a few meals' worth of cash. Professionals tried to adapt. Doctors treated patients in exchange for meat, eggs, or sacks of potatoes. Music teachers gave lessons for coal. Lawyers drafted contracts not for fees and marks, but for whatever tangible goods their clients could offer. At marketplaces, formal stalls gave way to improvised barter. A coat was worth so many kilos of flour. A set of chairs might be swapped for fuel. The more sophisticated functions of money, the store of value, the unit of account, had collapsed. Only its barest function as a temporary medium of exchange, a rapidly disintegrating bridge between goods, remained. Outside the cities, those who produced food understood this faster than anyone. Farmers looked at the dizzying numbers printed on banknotes and saw only one thing: unreliability. A bushel of wheat in the barn could feed a family. A stack of marks could not. Why load a wagon with grain, spend time and fuel hauling it to a city, and come back with bundles of paper that would be worthless by the time the horses were stabled? Many simply refused to sell. Others sold only for foreign currency, for gold, or in direct exchange for goods they needed. This was the moment when the monetary crisis turned into something more primal. Cities began to go hungry. In Berlin, Hamburg, and the industrial towns of the Ruhr and Saxony, queues lengthened in front of bakeries and butchers. Sometimes delivery trucks did not arrive at all. The government attempted to compel farmers to ship food, passing decrees and threatening penalties. But laws written in a dead currency carried little weight in villages where the memory of the last requisitions from wartime was still fresh. Inspectors could be ignored, and in any case, there were too few officials and too little fuel to enforce orders across countless farms. Hunger is a political solvent. Riots broke out, hunger revolts, as contemporary reports called them. Crowds stormed shops not to seize cash from tills, but to grab bread, sausages, sacks of flour, tins of preserved food. Money, the thing that had once stood between desire and possession, no longer mediated these encounters. It had become clutter. Havenstein's response to this was shaped by the same misreading that had guided him from the beginning. He saw shortages of food in cities and concluded that farmers were struggling with the mechanics of dealing in such large nominal sums. Prices were rising so fast, he reasoned, that a farmer might not have enough small notes to make change when selling an egg or a liter of milk. In his mind, the solution was obvious: provide more notes in more denominations. So he ordered the presses to run faster. New values appeared on their faces, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, then millions. Printers who had once taken pride in filigreed borders and careful engraving, now worked at breakneck speed, sacrificing quality for volume. Some notes were printed on only one side. Some arrived at banks with the ink still damp. Workers carried them in baskets from loading docks to counting rooms, stacking bricks of paper that were worth less every time a clock hand moved. The problem was not that Germany lacked enough money. The problem was that what it called money no longer fulfilled the role the word implied. Society had rejected the paper mark, and in doing so, it had rejected the promise that the state would preserve its value. Hovenstein, trained in a world where state and currency were inseparable, could not or would not see this. He believed that the desperate scramble for cash was evidence of scarcity, and that it was his patriotic obligation to alleviate that scarcity. He was trying to drown a fire because all his instruments were hoses. As summer turned to autumn in 1923, the numbers detached from reality completely. The total amount of currency in circulation broke previous records not by increments, but by orders of magnitude. Price lists became absurd. Workers who had once been paid monthly were now paid weekly, then daily, then in some factories twice a day. The shrill blast of a siren no longer meant only the start or end of a shift. It meant it was time to run, to the cashier, then to the nearest shop, before the next price rise. In offices and cafes, people followed a different kind of news. Not parliamentary debates, not speeches, but the latest dollar exchange rate. Newspapers printed it in bold. Later in the year, blackboards in the street would display it. It was the heartbeat of a dying currency. When the figure jumped, a wave of anxiety rippled across markets. When it briefly stabilized, there was a momentary fragile sense of reprieve. No one believed in the mark itself anymore. They believed, if they believed in anything, in the possibility that its fall might pause long enough for them to make it through the week. By now, Germany did not have an economy in the usual sense. It had motion without direction, effort without accumulation. The marks pouring from the presses did not deepen wealth, they eroded it. The institutions that had anchored middle-class life, banks, insurance funds, pension schemes, were revealed as vulnerable to a single, devastating policy choice, the decision to sacrifice the currency in the name of short-term survival. And yet, at the center of this storm, in the offices of the Reichsbank, the man overseeing the presses still believed he was serving the nation faithfully. Rudolf Havenstein was not plotting ruin. He was, in the most destructive way possible, trying to help. By autumn 1923, the last restraint snapped. Tax revenue, assessed in marks that died between calculation and payment, had become meaningless. The German state survived almost entirely on the output of the Reichsbank's presses. Rudolf Havenstein, once a banker, was now financing a collapsing republic with paper. October and November were the plunge into the void. Denominations jumped from millions to billions, then to trillions. Notes were printed on thin paper and rushed to banks with the ink still wet. Families burned them for heat because they were cheaper than firewood. For most people, a day's wage could not buy bread by evening. The solution, when it came, was psychological. In mid-November 1923, the government introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, and a new enforcer, Hjalmar Schacht. The Rentenmark was said to be backed by a mortgage on German land and industry, a legal fiction that nonetheless gave people something to believe in. Schacht did what Havenstein never had. He stopped the presses. Credit was cut off. Bankruptcies and unemployment spiked. But prices stabilized. Farmers accepted the new notes. Shopkeepers wrote price tags that remained valid all day. Hyperinflation ended. Its wound remained open. A middle class that had watched its money turn to ash would soon be asked to choose between a fragile republic and those promising certainty and revenge. Many, remembering 1923, no longer believed they had anything left to lose for a time.